Good afternoon. I'm Stephen Kantrowitz, Senior Director of Cultural Arts. Welcome to today's presentation, proudly sponsored by the J, where you can always find your Jewish center. On behalf of the J SAGE program and our co-sponsors, Cohen-Haddo Center for Judaic Studies at Wayne State University, ADL Michigan, and J-Learn, thank you for joining us for Before the Parade, the Leo Frank story featuring Professor Howard Lupovitch. SAGE is endowed by a generous gift from Sis Maisel and supported by Carol and Ronald P. Fogel, Sherry and David Jaffa, and Elena Michael Serling through the J's Pillars of Light program. SAGE inspires meaningful connections and important conversations. We thank all our donors for their continued support. Please join us for the next Scholars in Session program, Jews and Drag, an American Cultural History with Professor Golan Moskowitz from Tulane University on Sunday, March 16th, co-sponsored by the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies at University of Michigan. For tickets, visit JLive Detroit. Also, everyone, please mark your calendars for March 6th for an evening of inspiration with New York Times #1 best-selling author Brad Meltzer. March 23rd, a dazzling performance by the Schwesters, and March 30th for an unforgettable concert by the Guy Mantis Trio. All three events begin at 7 p.m. Visit theberman.org for tickets. Following this presentation, there will be a panel discussion Q&A moderated by Laura Rosenberg, Assistant Director, ADL Michigan. Joining the panel will be our very special guest today, Erica Lynn Schwartz. She's a multiple Tony Award-winning Broadway producer, Moulin Rouge, the musical, David Byrne's American Utopia, and Parade, amongst many others. Erica is Vice President of Theatrical Programming for ATG Entertainment. Her greatest productions are her daughters, Julia and Avi, with husband, Matt Picheny. Visit avalonroad.net. Please submit your questions to the Cultural Arts staff. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Carolyn Normandin, Regional Director, ADL Michigan. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. How are you? I'm Carolyn Normandin. As Steve said, I'm the Regional Director of the ADL Michigan. I know many of you. I see a lot of friendly faces. This is going to be a great program. Many of you know this, some do not. There are many similarities between 1913 and right now, today. Unfortunately, then, as now, our country faced rampant anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry in 1913. Xenophobia and anti-immigration were very prevalent. Books, newspapers, commentary, all types of things depicted Jews with stereotypes and conspiracies. We are still dealing with those anti-Semitic conspiracies today, driven by ancient tropes and alive and well on social media. Also in 1913, a Chicago attorney named Sigmund Livingston put forth the idea of an organization whose mission was to stop the defamation of Jewish people and secure equal justice for all. That ADL was born out of the clear understanding that Jews wouldn't be safe until everyone was safe, and no one would be safe until Jews were safe. During this time, one of Georgia's most notorious trials began. Leo Frank's death was a tragic outcome of a trial ripe with anti-Jewish overtones and innuendo, fueled by scapegoating, unjust media, and other types of hatred surrounding the trial. It was a clear signal at that time that ADL was crucially needed, and Leo's story became inextricably connected to ADL's mission. I don't know if you know this, but ADL was born through, in 1913, through the B'nai B'rith. And at the time of his arrest, Leo Frank was the president of the B'nai B'rith in Atlanta. It was this link that made me immediately say yes to Stephen when he asked if we would participate in this program. As I told Steve, I can't imagine a discussion about Leo Frank or the Tony Award-winning musical Parade without ADL. because the story tells us, the parade tells the story of Leo and Lucille Frank. So here we are today, and you're in for a treat. I will mention that when you came in, if you didn't grab one of these cards, take it home. There's a QR code on it that you can download the ADL's discussion guide and reflection packet that ADL created when the revival of Parade was on Broadway. So now let's get to the program. Dr. Howard Lupovitch is a fourth-generation Detroiter. He's a graduate of Hillel Day School. He holds both bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Michigan. He earned his PhD in history from Columbia. I know, he's a slacker. He's got lots and lots of, it's always a treat for me to hear Howie because he is so learned. He is currently the professor, he earned his PhD in history from Columbia. He is currently a professor of history and the director of the Cohen Haddow Center at Wayne State University, as Stephen mentioned. He is the author of many, many articles and books. Most recently, Translathian Paradise, A History of Budapest Jewish Community. Howie is a learned historian, gifted writer, and a good friend. Last fall, he was among a small group of Jewish professionals that ADL Michigan honored at our Walk Against Hate for his stalwart support of college students. It gives me true pleasure to introduce my friend, Dr. Howard Lupovitch.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? I think you can hear me. So thank you, Carolyn, for that very nice introduction. Thank you, Sage, and everyone else for including me and the Cohen Haddow Center in this program. And the one thing I would add to that introduction is I'm a proud graduate of Hillel Day School. I should add that to my description with an exclamation point. I can't not stand up in front of people and, Hillel made me the person I am, and the Jew I am, and the scholar I am, yada, yada, yada. Okay. We can do that, we'll do that another time, talk about how great Hillel is, but today. Let me get my glasses. So first, in the spirit of full disclosure, I have not seen the play Parade. I'm going to see it. I'm going to try to see it while it's here. It's a busy, busy time, but I'm going to try to see it. But just, I just want to be perfectly honest with you. But I do know a lot about Leo Frank, and I do know things about anti-Semitism in America and how the Leo Frank affair, how the trial and conviction in this episode fits into the broader history of anti-Semitism in America. And that's what I really want to address today. So first of all, as Carolyn mentioned, I think what's really somewhere near the forefront of our minds is the contemporary relevance of this story, because right now we are living in what historians would call an anti-Semitic moment. If we were talking about this maybe 20 years ago, we would be thinking about it more in terms of something that happened in the past. But where we are right now, it isn't just that we're dealing with anti-Semitism, it's that we're dealing with anti-Semitism coming from multiple directions. It's one of the biggest challenges we have as the Jewish community here, as the American Jewish community. One of the biggest challenges we have is is not to focus on just one kind while ignoring another kind. Let me be clear what I mean by that. Around the time of the Tree of Life shooting, we focused more on anti-Semitism as a product of xenophobia, and especially right-wing extremism and white supremacy, and we weren't paying as close attention to anti-Semitism emanating from the other side of the spectrum, which is what we're dealing with more now, especially on college campuses. But because we're turning our heads to look in another direction, we have to remember that all forms of anti-Semitism are there. You can't ignore the rest simply because you're focusing on one, which is one of the lessons that the story of Leo Frank really comes to illustrate for us. And when we have questions, if you want to hear more about the contemporary relevance or parallels or where we are now, we can definitely talk about that as well. So let me just to make sure we're all on the same page, let me give you, first of all, my phone. I have a time limit. Okay. All right, so let's say I started about 3 minutes ago, which means, okay, all right. I just got to watch the clock. Because I could talk about this forever. So let me give you the short version, and I'll give you the longer, broader version. The short version of this story is a Brooklyn-born Jew named Leo Frank, who had been hired to manage as the superintendent of a pencil factory in Atlanta around the turn of the 20th century, was accused in 1913 of sexually abusing and murdering a 13-year-old girl named Mary Fagan. He was arrested. He was brought to trial. There were a lot of problems with the case. It was largely circumstantial. There was a lot of controversy around it. He was convicted despite all the problems of the case. The governor of Georgia commuted his sentence, but when they transported him to a different prison camp, at which point a lynch mob got a hold of him and killed him in 1915. Now that really wasn't the end of the story, because remember, prior to his being murdered, the governor had commuted his sentence. There always were lingering concerns. Decades later, other testimony came forward. Other people who were there remembered things, and it turns out we now know pretty much beyond a shadow of a doubt, certainly beyond a reasonable doubt, that he was innocent. So we can say this was a Jew not only accused and convicted and killed, but a Jew who was wrongfully accused, convicted, and killed. So that's the short version. Let's broaden it a little bit. Let's situate it in the broader context of, well, two broader contexts really. The broader context of anti-Semitism in turn of the 20th century America. But since this story takes place in the South, let's also situate it in the context of what it meant to be Jewish in the American South at the turn of the 20th century. Now, these two things are related, but let me take them one at a time. In terms of anti-Semitism at the turn of the 20th century, the first thing we have to understand, it took place in 1913. And in American history, the year 1913, or the years leading up to World War I, really, when you look at them, there's a certain tension, almost a contradiction in what's taking place in America. Now, most historians and others, when they describe the years leading up to World War I, both in America and in Europe, this is usually known as the Age of Progress. There was this firm belief shared by many, many people in North America and in Europe that the world was getting better, was improving, and that things like hatred, hunger, disease, bigotry, prejudice, injustice were diminishing and would eventually be eliminated. Well, problems like starvation and disease would be eliminated through advances in science and medicine and technology, and problems like hatred, bigotry, and prejudice would be improved through education and the spread of the basic ideas of enlightenment and liberalism, which were the hallmark of American society. But there was this general impression that the country was not only moving in the right direction, it was moving an accelerating pace in the right direction. So, for example, if you open up, there were many novels written before World War I with this image of the future. And in these futuristic utopian novels written during the Age of Progress, you have the vision is everyone has enough to eat, everyone has their own house, everyone lives comfortably, there's no disease, everyone gets along, everyone not only has a house, but maybe a car or even an airplane. If you want to vision what they were describing, if you ever saw the show The Jetsons, that's how they were envisioning the future, and not the distant future, the near future, because whatever the notion was, whatever problems were still around, enlightenment, science, medicine, technology, advances in all of these things would eliminate problems. All the problems were solvable, and they would be solved relatively quickly. That was the vision. Now, In addition to being known as the Age of Progress, this is also a time when in America there was a movement that had been around by 1913 for about maybe 20 years, maybe a little longer, depending how you measure it, known as the Progressive Movement. Now I know today among some people the word progressive can be a bad word, and it gets lumped in together with socialism, communism, Bolshevism, Marxism, Stalinism. It's none of those things. The basic notion of progressivism, it was a rethinking of liberalism. It was a rethinking of the basic values of American society and culture and politics. You see, the problem was people who embraced the ideas of the progressive movement, they believed that the intentions of America were good. This notion of everyone having rights, equality before the law. But in order to get there, not only people, but even government would have to intervene more to move things in the right direction. So for example, there was this pervasive notion that government should not intervene in the economy. This was known as laissez-faire, just allow the economy develop, not regulate factory workers, or not regulate anything about the economy. And every 10 years, the natural business cycle led to an economic recession. People were out of work. There was not yet anything what we would call any safety net, any social safety net. There was no welfare or unemployment. So when the economy would collapse, people would lose their jobs, and they would just be impoverished, because there was no such thing as unemployment. If someone was injured on the job, there was no such thing as workman's comp. Factory owners didn't have to take safety measures. And the reason, and of course, workers were not allowed to organize into unions. And all of those things, the absence of all of those things was defended in the right to property of the person who owned the business of the factory. And the notion was, yes, the right to property is a sacred right, but look where it's left us. It's left us in a situation where a lot of people are suffering. It needs to be better. So the progressive movement introduced changes, some of which seem very second nature to us. For example, there should be a limit on the number of hours a person can be asked to work in one day, and there should be an age minimum when a person should go to work. A 10-year-old child shouldn't work 18 hours a day. Believe it or not, during the progressive era, what I just said was a radical idea. If I had said that in a room like this 100 years ago, half of you would have thought I was a crazy radical trying whatever. No, that's a pretty mainstream idea now. So it was necessary. And the progressive movement had made some gains by 1913. There were certain regulations. They broke up the big monopolies. There were safety regulations. The owner was responsible for the safety of his workers. If someone lost their job, they would get some assistance. Children were required to go to school, not to work. That's an investment in the future. Imagine that, a law requiring that children go to school and not go work in a factory or a coal mine. That's what they were going for. And so the progressive movement, combined with the overall atmosphere of the Age of Progress, really created a very optimistic sense. But there was also a dark side. These notions of progress and this sense of accomplishment in certain ways was at odds with the fact that there were still some very serious problems. First of all, there still was profound inequality. First of all, there was economic inequality. I mean, there were people who were profiting and doing better, but there were a lot of people who were still poor and really had no way to get out from under it. There was inequality between men and women. There was inequality between people who were white and people of color. Black people in particular were struggling and hadn't benefited yet. So that was the basic situation there. Now, one of the other problems, and the one that concerned Jews more directly, is there was a kind of ambivalence during the years leading up to the First World War about immigrants and immigration. Now, After World War I, there's going to be a surge of xenophobia, and immigration is going to be severely restricted. But remember, we're still talking about an age where there isn't that much restriction on anything, including immigration, and a lot of immigrants are coming into the country from multiple directions. There are immigrants coming from Europe. By this point, it's mostly from Eastern Europe. There are immigrants coming from the South, from Mexico and other Latin American countries. There are immigrants coming from the East, from China and other parts of East Asia. And on the one hand, there were people who loved immigrants coming in because on the whole, immigrants meant cheap labor. But on the other hand, there were people who were not becoming, well, let's say less and less thrilled with the idea of immigrants. Initially, there was an economic concern. Immigrants will take away jobs from the people who are here. Same problem we have right now. But by the year 1913, the other stereotypes or the other concerns about immigrants were beginning to surface as well. And I'm going to tell you what they are. And it's the same negative stereotypes and prejudices about immigrants we hear right now. So there was a notion that immigrants bring with them crime. And above all, Jewish immigrants bring crime. Let me give you a specific example. Most Jewish immigrants coming into the country obviously were coming into New York City. And in 1908, the chief of police of the NYPD, Chief Binghamton, he was asked in an interview to explain the rising crime rate in the boroughs of New York City, and especially the rise in violent crime. And he said simply, this is the fault of Russian Jews. Russian Jews are bringing crime, and they're bringing crime. And that idea spread to other places. There was a notion in other parts of the country, too, that if there was a rising crime rate, it wasn't just the fault of Jews, it was the fault of Jewish immigrants. Secondly, there was a notion that immigrants bring in disease. There was an outbreak of cholera in New York City and other eastern cities in 1892, and immigrants from Europe were blamed, and above all, Russian Jewish immigrants were blamed for that as well. So crime and disease, and of course, radical politics. Immigrants are bringing the crazy radicalism, anarchism, and communism from Europe. They're bringing it all to America. Now, as I said, before World War I, a lot of this anti-immigrant sentiment was still muted. It was in its infancy. It was let's say it was gestating. It wouldn't become fully developed until after the First World War, but it was certainly there. It was certainly simmering beneath the surface. And so when people's attitudes towards Jews, it was a kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, there were some who believed that, like other immigrants, Jews come here, they work hard, they help not only economically, but they help building the economy and the culture, and they help building the country. But there were others who thought that Jews, like other immigrants, are outsiders who are undermining the strength and the vitality and the goodness and the overall Christian nature of American society. And that's one of the things you have to keep in mind here. In 1913, there were many people in America who were not Christian, and there were even more people who were not Protestant, but the image of what a true American was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's what the true American was. This was a mentality known as the melting pot. People come from all places, but once here, they're expected basically to check their cultural baggage in the door and to become American. And becoming American meant becoming some very specific things. So that, in a nutshell, that's the level of anti-Semitism. For the most part, prior to this episode with Leo Frank, there weren't overt incidents. In fact, I would say that the anti-Semitism was more what we would call social anti-Semitism. It was personal points of view. It didn't really manifest itself that much. I'll give you a typical example of the most pervasive form of anti-Semitism in turn of the 20th century America. It was ideas and attitudes expressed by certain segments of society, but expressed more privately as opposed to publicly or politically. I'll give you an example. There was a man in New York City named Henry Adams. Yes, he was descendant of those Adams. He was a descendant of John Adams and John Quincy Adams, but he certainly wasn't them. I guess I would make the analogy. I think John Adams would be as proud as his great-grandson Henry Adams, as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. would be as proud as his son. I think it's a comparable situation. So this is what Henry Adams was. He was an Adams. He was upper class. He was educated. He was the closest thing we have to a Brahmin here in America. And he wrote a letter to his friend Charles Milner Gaskell. He wrote a couple letters about Jews. This is how he felt about Jews. So this is basically American elite society. This is their attitude towards Jews. I am myself more than ever at odds with my time. I detest it and everything that belongs to it, and live only in the wish to see the end of it with all its infernal Jewry. I want to put every moneylender to death and sink Lombard Street, which is in London, and Wall Street under the ocean. Then perhaps men of our kind might have some chance of being honorably killed in battle and eaten by our enemies. But now we are in the hands of the Jews. They can do what they please with our values. In other words, this is a member of an elite family. And an influential family who feels that American society is not only being undermined by Jews, but Jews are a powerful force and an unstoppable force. If you've ever seen the show on HBO called The Gilded Age, you have the old money threatened by the new money. Now, in The Gilded Age, it isn't about Jews yet, though I think at the end of season 2, they've sort of teed up the fact that in season 3, they're going to start talking about Jewish immigrants. They made a couple little hints, but it's really about other upstart, nouveau riche people, and the elites are terrified of being displaced by them. Henry Adams lived a little bit later, and for him, the danger is coming from Jews. He wrote another letter to that same friend in 1914, kind of the sequel. Now, this is when he was 76 and close to death, and he said, "The winter is nearly over. I am 76 years old and nearly over too. The atmosphere really has become a Jew atmosphere. It is curious and evidently good for some people, but it isolates me. I do not know the language, and my friends are as ignorant as I. We are still in power after a fashion. Our sway over what we call society is undisputed. We keep Jews far away, and the anti-Jew feeling is quite rabid. We are anti-everything Jewish, yet somehow seem to be more Jewish every day." He's lamenting a kind of inevitability of how Jewish New York is becoming. Imagine if he lived in New York City today. But remember, he wasn't only bothered by Jews. For Henry Adams, becoming more Jewish, the city or the society, is symptomatic of it becoming less like him. That, I think, is the anti-Semitic context. And I think that's true everywhere. But remember, Leo Frank and everything that happened to him happened not only in the United States generally, but it happened in the South. And so we have to understand what it meant to be Jewish in the South as well. And here, the thing to remember, and might be a little bit counterintuitive for us now, is 1913 in the southern United States, really everywhere in the United States. This is before the point where Jews were regarded as white. For many people, to be white meant at the very least to be Christian. It wasn't only about appearance. It meant also to be Christian, and for some, to be Protestant. And so if you were Italian, you were not as white as someone who was Protestant. If you were Irish, you weren't as white. If you were a Slavic, most of whom are Catholic, or some kind of Eastern Orthodox, you weren't white. Jews were not considered white. And so Southern Jews, they found themselves in a situation. This is really, for a century leading up to 1913, they found themselves in a situation where it was easier for them to pass as white as long as they didn't look too Jewish or act too Jewish. But the bottom line is, when they were discovered to be Jewish, they were on the outs. They were excluded. They were seen as being not fully American. They were American citizens, yes, but they weren't fully welcome anywhere. And in some situations, in some cases, when there were race riots against black people, they would easily spread to be also attacks on Jewish stores as well. You know, there were some parts in some areas of the American South when Jews began to arrive from Eastern Europe. A lot of the white people living in these places had trouble distinguishing Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe from black people who were their neighbors. It also created an interesting relationship between the Jewish community in Atlanta and the black community in Atlanta. On the one hand, from the vantage point of black people, Jews did look white, and it was easier for them to pass as white, and they seemed to be more accepted by mainstream white society. But on the other hand, there was a kind of camaraderie. It was not uncommon that during this age of segregation and Jim Crow, that a black person would know if he went into a store owned by a Jew, he would be served properly and honorably and respectfully, whereas if he went into a store by a white Christian, he was more likely to be ignored, to be shunned, or to be kicked out entirely. There was this reputation, there was this notion of a kind of camaraderie. And there was a reason for it as well, because there was a kind of solidarity, or at least cooperation, between the philanthropic elements of the Jewish community and the philanthropic elements of the black community. I think the most dramatic example is there was a leader in the black community whose name was Booker T. Washington. He was one of the founders of the Tuskegee Institute. He believed in working within the system to improve the lot of black people. And beginning of the 20th century, he worked with a philanthropic American Jew named Julius Rosenwald. Julius Rosenwald, he came from an immigrant family. He became the president of Sears Roebuck. He was someone very wealthy and very philanthropic. They created a network of schools for black children across the American South that came to be known as the Rosenwald Schools. There were thousands of them. And they set up these schools for black children, Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, in places where there was, if black children had any opportunity for education, it would be mediocre or next to nothing. It was transformative. And for several generations, there were just dozens and dozens of black children who grew up to be prominent leaders of the black community. And even today, the memory of the Rosenwald schools, this is a great example of this kind of solidarity. Now all of this really is the background to Leo Frank, to the story. Because remember, first of all, he's Jewish in the South, in Atlanta. Remember also from the vantage point of the South, this is 1913. This isn't that long after the end of Reconstruction. And Reconstruction, and from the Southern point of view, the intervention of the federal government into local affairs, rebuilding the South after the Civil War, had left a bitter taste. And so there still was this resentment against anything that was seen as being Northern. And so when the combination of a certain animosity towards Jews with an animosity towards Yankees, towards Northerners, especially someone from New York City, which is not only a place being seen as very Jewish, but also very Northern. Leo Frank wasn't only a Jew, he was a Jewish carpetbagger. He was coming down and running a factory. A Northerner coming down and doing something which a Southerner really should have been doing. It wasn't just someone Jewish whose family was an immigrant family, taking away the job of some good white Southerners. It was a Northerner doing it as well. All of this really added up to doing it. And this is one of the reasons why, even though the case against him was not very strong, it was a largely circumstantial case. In fact, the main witness against him was the custodian of the factory, whose name was Jim Conley. He gave 3 or 4 depositions, all of which were wildly contradictory, and what he eventually said on the stand contradicted all of that. You know, he part of his testimony, because he also was a suspect in the murder, and part of his testimony was that he helped Leo Frank carry the body of the dead girl out of the factory and hide it. And because he testified to that, that really sealed the case against Leo Frank, or at least gave it some kind of substance. Conley was given a very light sentence. He was sentenced to 1 year of labor in a chain gang and then let go. Later on, in 1982, one of the witnesses who came forward said he remembered Conley carrying the body out by himself. He also remembered Leo Frank not being there. This was a young man at the time named Alonzo Mann, who came forward years and years later. And what these later witnesses said is the reason they didn't come forward at the time is they were terrified. So you have to picture the trial, not just a trial taking place, like on Law and Order or something. Outside the windows of the courthouse, there was an angry mob screaming for the head of Leo Frank. And not only doing that, but with the same anger and vitriol, threatening the life of anyone who had the gall to defend him, be it his defense attorney or his defense team, witnesses, the jury, even the judge. So the trial took place in a highly antagonistic atmosphere. And even at the time, it was pretty clear that given the larger attitudes that were at play, attitudes about immigrants, attitudes about Northerners, attitudes about Jews in particular, with all that at play, even observers at the time questioned whether or not this really was a fair trial. There's one element that I want to mention as well, and this is what I mean by multiple kinds of anti-Semitism. See, the believability that a Jew could do this to a young girl was spurred in part by one kind of anti-Semitism, an older religious Christian anti-Semitism, namely, more specifically, the blood libel. There was still this belief that one of the things that Jews do is murder Christian children for sacramental purposes. And if you'd heard that, if you'd learned that in church or in Sunday school, or heard it from a preacher, and then there was a report in the newspaper, or you heard a rumor or a report or the gossip about the Jewish manager of a factory doing this to a Christian child, it made it a notch more believable, or at least a notch less unbelievable. From a strictly Christian point of view, because of that old myth of the blood libel, it was believable. Now, that older Christian anti-Semitism, in this case, also merged and was fortified by a newer racial anti-Semitism. Racial anti-Semitism was something that began mid-19th century, and at the core of racial anti-Semitism is it's an application of a scientific theory, or a social scientific theory called social Darwinism, where, if you're not familiar, Darwin said different species in nature compete for survival. Survival of the fittest through natural selection, and some species can only survive at the expense of other species. Social Darwinism said the same thing, but about humanity. Some groups within humanity could only survive at the expense of others, and at the heart of this notion of this idea of racial anti-Semitism was that Jews as a race could only survive, let alone thrive, at the expense of others, or members of other races. Now you take the two together, the older notion of the blood libel and the newer notion that Jews as a race need to destroy or crush other races, it made it even more believable than that. But of course, it wasn't believable to everyone. And really the last part of this story, and I think an important part of the legacy of this story is this story does not end with the conviction of with him being convicted, or Leo Frank even with him being lynched. It really set in motion a Jewish response to anti-Semitism. Now, as Caroline mentioned, the fact that the founding of ADL was a response to this is enormously important. Now, I should say that officially ADL was founded in the aftermath of Leo Frank. But the mentality that crystallized into ADL, it was around before Leo Frank. It was something that was less organized. It was more amorphous. It was more decentralized. Most Jews in America, well, first of all, many Jews, they were buying into this notion that America was getting better and that prejudice was disappearing. But even when they saw manifestations of anti-Semitism, they believed that you could work within the system to combat it. And in some ways, that was actually true in this case, too. The fact that the governor of Georgia, John Marshall Slayton, after Leo Frank was convicted, commuted the sentence, that was an example of the system working in favor of Jews. Now, of course, the lynching really showed that other dark underbelly, which the governor's actions weren't able to do. But this really, for the Jewish community of Atlanta, this is a moment where the Jewish community, I would say, really achieves consciousness. It really becomes a much closer knit and coordinated Jewish community, not only in dealing with anti-Semitism, but in all facets of Jewish communal life. This is a transformative moment for the Jewish community of Atlanta. But insofar as this was an event which received national coverage and everybody knew about it, it sent a shockwave through American Jewry, saying that, yes, things may be getting better, but we have to be aware. For Jews in Detroit, the fact that Leo Frank happened 10 years before Jews had to start dealing with Henry Ford and then Father Coughlin, it sort of gave us Jews in Detroit a bit of a head start. There was already a bit of a template of how to deal with the subsequent anti-Semitic moments that happened later in Detroit. And you know, it's interesting, and I guess I'll conclude by mentioning that, well, first of all, yes, ADL was one of the byproducts of this. The darker side byproduct is that in the aftermath of this, there was a resurgence of the KKK in Georgia. For people with that attitude, they saw the conviction and then the lynching of Leo Frank as a vindication, something to celebrate. We're taking back the country, taking it back. We're stopping these changes and this undermining of what it means, what the true Americanism means. You know, the forefront of that was a journalist whose name was Thomas Watson, who wrote for the Jeffersonian, and he was the one, not the only one, but he was the loudest voice in the chorus, calling for the head of Leo Frank and calling on everyone to support his conviction and basically threatening anyone who didn't. And not long after, his coverage of the Leo Frank affair, it propelled him into the political arena in Georgia, and really was the birth of he became a member of Congress, and his entire platform was, I was the one who spoke out against Leo Frank. So there was a certain power there. But the awareness it gave American Jews cannot be underestimated. You know, I'll give you one example. As part of Leo Frank's defense team, certainly when he was filing appeals that were ultimately not accepted, was a leading Jewish lawyer, the other leading Jewish lawyer in the country, whose name was not Louis Brandeis, it was Louis Marshall. Marshall was a prominent lawyer in New York, also wealthy and a leader of American Jewry. And this is what Marshall wrote in the Jewish Daily Bulletin in November of 1927. This is 15 years after, or 14 years after the trial, 12 years after he was lynched. Quote, "The trial was a travesty of justice. The record shows that while the trial was in progress, the windows of the courtroom looking out upon the adjoining streets were open, and that large and boisterous crowds were gathered in the street and were engaged in noisy demonstrations." So he said, yes, this trial was not a fair trial. But he also goes on to commend the actions of the governor. Now, the governor had to leave town to get away from this mob, and it was the end of any political aspirations. He left politics entirely. One last comment, just to give you a sense. In the immediate, all of this creating ADL and raising this awareness about anti-Semitism, this was more of a long-term effect. In the short term, it really laid bare an attitude towards Jews that in 1913 and around that 1915 was more prevalent than most Jews understood. But if there was any doubt after the Leo Frank affair, 2 years later, there was another national event which underscored the presence and the prevalence of that same mentality. And this was the nomination of the first Jew to the Supreme Court, Louis Brandeis. Now, he was nominated in 1915. To this point in time, when a Supreme Court justice had been nominated, it was almost a pro forma approval from Congress, from the Senate. This was the first time ever where before a Supreme Court justice was appointed, there were congressional hearings in the Senate. Brandeis was the first one who was vetted, and he was vetted mercilessly. The stuff we hear today, a cakewalk compared to what Brandeis had to go through. It was Brandeis, so he was steadfast. There were two sitting members of the Supreme Court who said they wouldn't adjudicate cases with him. So Leo Frank was a moment, a dramatic moment, but it underscored a broader problem, which from that point on, the American Jewish community began to deal with. But it also was a wake-up call for those segments of American society that believed that such an attitude, that anti-Semitism and other forms of prejudice were wrong. And the Leo Frank affair and the whole affair with Brandeis, this was a wake-up call for them as well. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was 40 minutes.
Hi, thanks. So yeah, I'm Laura Rosenberg. I'm the Associate Director of ADL Michigan. Moderating this panel, I'm going to channel my inner Johnny Carson to gear up. But I do want to level set first. So I work for ADL Michigan, and my boss Carolyn here is the Regional Director. And we heard Howard talk a lot about the history of anti-Semitism at the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century. And I just want to thank you. I want to level set, and so we know that ADL was founded in 1913, which was not in direct conjunction with the lynching of Leo Frank. But what I want to talk about and have Carolyn answer first is really about the anti-Semitism that we see today and the work that we do at ADL to help to combat it. Our mission is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure fair and just treatment for all. So Carolyn, if you wouldn't mind just talking a bit about the work that we do currently.
Thanks, Laura. My good friend Howie, he rightly said the idea for ADL had started before the lynching of Leo Frank. The reason Leo Frank was so linked to this is exactly what Howard said. People had started to pay attention, and ADL was galvanized by it. So that's why Leo Frank and the ADL story are so connected. Nowadays, we are still fighting this issue, and by the way, we're still fighting the same types of blood libel, Jewish power, the protocols of the elders of Zion, alive and well, living in your cell phone. ADL's mission is to educate, to advocate, and to investigate. And so the advocacy we do is part and parcel of working through the system. We file court cases. I will say in the last year, we have filed more court cases in the last year than we have during the entirety of ADL's mission. And we've been successful. There is we've worked along Title VI complaints, the Philadelphia schools, the Berkeley schools. We are going in with partners to do that. So advocating through the system is very important to us. On Tuesday, I'm going to be with the governor because we helped to add characteristics to Michigan's hate crimes law. We testified on behalf of the characteristics being expanded at the hate crimes law, both for the House and the Senate. So it does work. So that's the advocacy. The education is things like this, is working in the schools. And then the investigation, Laura takes the lead on incidents that are reported to ADL. Anybody can report an incident to ADL, Jewish people, non-Jewish people, and we look at every incident with the same stalwart fervor because we believe in our mission. And we haven't deviated from that in 113 years.
Perfect. Thanks, Carolyn. I also want to level set. We have Erica on stage here. Erica, could you introduce yourself and tell everybody?
Yeah, sure. Thank
your
you.
story? Yeah.
And thank you for all the work that you do. So both of you. I should say all three of you. Thank you. Sure. My name's Erica Schwartz. I'm a producer. I live in New York. I am very proudly Jewish. It's amazing that there's a Maccabi event back over here today because I was like, I did the Maccabi games. This is great. So I've been working in the theater since I was a teenager. I just love it. And for me, theater was always where I found a place where I could learn about myself and express myself and learn about what makes other people tick and maybe expose people to situations that they weren't aware of or didn't know about because that's how I learned about other cultures. You mentioned Tuskegee University, and I remember in high school, once I said something to my teacher, and I'm like, oh, and the answer was Tuskegee University, and he goes, how'd you know that? We didn't teach it yet. And I said, the musical ragtime. But for me, theater is how I found entrance into worlds that were beyond my own. So it's now very full circle for me. I've been working and producing quite a long time, and Parade came into my life 20 years ago when the original production of Parade came out. I was a senior in high school. I was living in Connecticut, and I saw something on PBS. There was like an interview with some of the actors, and I heard it was a story about anti-Semitism, and I went to the breakfast table the next morning, and I said, Mom and Dad, what are we doing this weekend? And they said, oh, we have plans, blah, blah. And I said, no, we're going to go to Lincoln Center. There's this new musical about a true story of anti-Semitism that took place in America, and we need to go see this. And so we did. And several years later, when I met the writers, my father was very excited talking to them, and he said, "Oh, we saw the show at Lincoln Center," and they said, "Oh, you're one of like 5 people, thanks so much," because it was not very positively received 20 years ago, because like Howard was saying, 20 years ago, anti-Semitism didn't seem very topical and didn't seem as pressing. And so it was kind of this historical piece. One of the writers, Jason Robert Brown, who has become an incredibly celebrated music theater composer, who won a Tony Award at the time when he wrote Parade, but that was pretty much the only accolade it received at the time, has gone on, and Parade itself and many other shows that he has written have become incredibly prominent parts of American musical theater. When he spoke to the cast that's touring, that will be here in a few weeks, he said, you know, I wrote this 20 years ago, and I thought it was just, you know, when I was invited to be a part of this, I thought it was a nice historical thing, and it was a nod to my family and my culture, and I thought I would go on. And he said, and here we are 20 years later, and I wish it was just part of this like nice historical thing, but it's actually much more important now, and I just am so proud, and I never knew that this was going to be the thing that I was going to be known for, but it is the thing that I'm most proud to be known for because it is so important, and the fact that it is going around the country, and that it is having this big tour, and that so many more people will be exposed to this story, especially now, is the most meaningful.
Perfect, thank you. And then can you expand, so we were talking before this event, and you were saying that you were in New York recently, and you're gonna be in Charlotte tomorrow, promoting Parade and working with, you know, at other events like this. So what are you noticing in terms of like a through line in these spaces that people are talking to you about, having conversations with each other in terms of the importance of Parade currently?
Sure, there's several, and Howard, I love that you also brought about the relationship between the Jewish population and the Black population, because there's a lot in the musical and in the story that's actually explored about Leo being from the North and how he uses Yiddish words, and nobody in the South uses Yiddish words. In fact, we had a T-shirt on Broadway that said "Howdy Shalom," and it was like the biggest selling piece of merchandise we had because people thought it was so funny. But the relationship as we go around the country, there's a lot of responses. First of all, and I hate to say it, but we didn't get a lot of traction from a lot of theaters in the South. Still, it's 2025, and we're not playing Florida. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just an ironic, like, this is where we are in the world. So the cities that we're playing, we're very, very excited, not just from the conversations that are happening within the Jewish community, but conversations that are happening from social activism communities, from Black communities. There are several Black company members who are very actively saying, what's the outreach that's being done to our community, because they need to see this story too, right? And the fact that there's a lynching in the show and how it's depicted is actually still very personal and very topical. So these are larger conversations that we're having. I would also encourage those of you here, because many people think of music theater as comedy and we want fun, and this isn't a fun story, and what is this going to be on the stage? I would say if there are people in your family who are bar mitzvah age or older, this is incredibly important, and they are learning about those things in Holocaust studies in school. And I think the show does an incredible job of really, you know, exposing parts of our history, but also reminding people how, when confronted with true adversity, how there is still hope and love, and how a community can come together, and those people who do rise up. So if you're wondering, you know, is this appropriate? Those are the kinds of conversation that we're hoping to spark and to continue.
Perfect, thank you. On to Howard, some more historical questions, I believe, from the audience. Somebody asked, did they ever find the real perpetrator?
Did they ever find the real perpetrator? Maybe, probably. The person they think was the most likely to be the perpetrator was James Conley. The witnesses came forward. His testimony at the beginning was suspect. He was pressured, but beyond the, it's pretty clear that it wasn't Leo Frank. It's likely that it was James Conley. That's about as close as they've gotten to something fully definitive. If more evidence comes forth in the future, and Leo Frank was given a full pardon by the Georgia State Legislature in 1986. So, you know, for the record, he's no longer guilty of this crime. But who actually did it for sure? Maybe James Conley, maybe someone else. The truth is, in 1913, it could have been a lot of different people.
Go ahead, Carolyn.
I'll add to that. It's exactly right what Howard said. 4 years after Alonzo Mann came forward, and he worked in the pencil factory. He was a young man, and he came forward in 1982. And it took 4 years for Leo Frank to become posthumously pardoned. And ADL had a lot of legal power behind that. But what really cracked the case was this affidavit that Alonzo Mann swore to. And Howard mentioned, there was all this pressure. There was this black dichotomy, this Jewish dichotomy. There was all this pressure. And of course, Tom Watson and the Jeffersonian just every day giving virulent anti-Semitic pictures, what we would call a meme nowadays, caricatures of this, fueled this, so that it kind of became a train that was running and no one could stop it until 1982 when the affidavit was signed.
I would also add that in terms of the Jeffersonian, his newspaper, this is the age when it's really the beginning of mass media, because daily and weekly newspapers had been around, but not that long. This is the age, on the positive side, this is the age of the muckrakers like Ida Tarbell, who are able to expose things, using as journalists. But it's also the age of yellow journalism, where they're not letting a few facts spoil a good story. Everything's sensationalized immediately, no patience to wait for a story. Not nearly as fast as we deal with today. What we have today with social media, and even to some extent mainstream media, is a much more rapid version, a much more accelerated and intensified version of what was around at the time of Leo Frank. But it definitely was a problem. People could read about it every day or every week. And Tom Watson, like I said, not someone to let a few facts spoil a good story.
I really have to jump in here because I've got a quote from Thomas Watson. Was actually printed in the Jeffersonian, one of many, many things that were printed. You could tell that Frank is a lascivious pervert, guilty of the crime by a study of his picture. Look at those bulging beastly eyes, the protruding sensual lips, and also the animal jaw. Watson called Frank a Jewish hunter of Gentile girls. So what Howard talked about with blood libel. This is the kind of tropes and disgusting, vile things that were written in the paper in Atlanta. And these are the kind of thing, I like your don't let the facts get in the way of a good story, because that's what I would tell everyone here. Don't believe everything you read. Check your facts. Go to reliable sources. And don't just throw something over the wall because you read it on Facebook. Because that's what was happening here. Only the difference was it was a printed version. It wasn't in your pocket.
Perfect, thank you. A question probably also for Howard as well that an audience member asked, what became of Leo Frank's family after his lynching?
Great question. His wife was really at the heart of advocating for him. I mean, they were not driven out of Atlanta. In fact, as far as I know, they continued to be there. This is a point, I think one of the things that helped them is that while there were segments of Atlanta society that were highly racist and prejudiced, there also was the part who were more open and progressive and tolerant. And in a way, Leo Frank's family were seen as whatever the non-religious version of martyrs were, and they were embraced in that way. So I'm not going to say that their life was easy, because they were definitely the family of Leo Frank. And for those who demonize Leo Frank and those who believe Tom Watson and the rest of that nonsense that he was printing, family, they were by extension, they were the family of the murderer, of the lascivious Jew, which incidentally isn't only the blood libel, it's the blood libel combined with racist tropes together, which made it a lot more potent. But the family persevered. The family went on, and eventually the family, sank back into anonymity, where most of us belong and where most of us thrive.
Yeah, thank you. We actually, the show is actually from Lucille's perspective, right? So it's very much about Lucille's journey. And at the beginning, I'm not, you have to come see it. But at the beginning, she's a little bit embarrassed. He says Meshuggah, and I always love watching the show in various cities, to your point, Laura, because when he says Meshuggah and there's different pockets of the audience laugh, I go, oh, there's the Jews, right? So it's great. But she's like, why do you use those words? And he's like, because they're Jewish words. They're words that our people use. And she's like, well, we don't, So there's a lot about her evolution in terms of embracing who she is and finding her strength through massive adversity. I mean, she is ostracized. At first, she wasn't going to go to the trial because of exactly what you were describing. There are depictions of the mob mentality around this young. They were very young. They were in their 20s. I think you can't forget that. This is a young couple. He came down to manage the factory through a familial connection. He meets this woman. It's a nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn, right? Story we all know well. And then they're faced with this very early on in their marriage. They have no children. And so it's very much about her. I think we're out of battery, or I'm talking too much. But she, as the show evolves, without giving away too much, she becomes his voice. She becomes the one who's really pushing this forward. She makes a personal plea to the governor. She is the one who's out there. So very much it's about their love and their finding a commitment to each other in this society that is just constantly looking for someone to blame.
Perfect. Thank you.
And I would just add, in that sense, that's the parallel, but one of the parallels between Leo Frank and Dreyfus. Because after Dreyfus was convicted, his wife also was his big advocate. Now that had a much happier ending. Dreyfus was eventually retried and acquitted, and Leo Frank, he was only posthumously pardoned. But the role of the wife here, but Dreyfus's family in France, basically they went on business as usual. And in some ways, Leo Frank's family, they faced the common challenges. If you were Jewish in the South, you could be accepted only insofar as you weren't too overtly Jewish.
Perfect, thank you. We have a question probably for Erica. Also, I'm not sure how the timing is going, so just start gesticulating at me in the back. Okay, perfect. There is a question here, and I apologize if I'm doing the best to read some of the handwriting. But there's a question about any sort of pushback maybe you might have received with Parade in various cities. What has that looked like, security-wise, I suppose?
Yeah. Sure, it's a great question, and it's something we take very seriously, right? So from a security perspective, there are several protocols that I won't speak about, but that we do follow when we're traveling around the country that we have in place. There was, on the first performance on Broadway, there was a group that was flyering the audience who was waiting to go in that we did not explain in the press who it was, but it was the Proud Boys. They came down, and they were at our first preview on Broadway. I'm glad that the Proud Boys don't know the difference between first preview and opening night, because it wasn't a big event for us. It was just our first performance, but the flyers were talking about the molester Leo Frank and had depictions of, stereotypical negative Jewish connotations. So we have, in one of our first cities, we're in our third city right now. In our first city, the venue did receive a very, copy and paste email from someone who was CCing the Black Lives Matter and the NAACP, and that those scholars who speak about Leo Frank now blame a black person, which obviously they're referencing James Conley, which is not fact, right? The case is still open to this day, technically. But that this is long settled, that Leo Frank was a molester, blah, blah. So we do get communications. For us, security is paramount, and telling the story is the best way to kind of counteract any negativity that's out there. And the importance of the company in coming together, and why it is important to them to be, they will prevail because they are driven to tell this story. And I think that's how all of us who work on this show, I think all of us who work in the theater feel about using art as a medium to communicate greater stories. But the company is incredibly dedicated. Anything from a press perspective that we ask them to do, they are front and center. Many of them are Jewish. Our two leads are Jewish. It was important that we had people cast in the company and crew who were tied to the historical significance.
Sure, yeah, thanks. And that kind of leads me into the next question. I also, the Proud Boys, Howard was talking earlier about the anti-Semitism at the turn of the 20th century, and these, white Anglo-Saxon, I think was the phrase that you used, people who really felt that Jews and Jewish immigrants were taking away from like the kind of America that they were looking for. And the Proud Boys, of course, are also a group just like that today. And something that we see a lot at ADL, you mentioned flyering. We had in October 14 cities in Michigan that were flyered by a group not dissimilar to the Proud Boys. And it's something that we deal with all the time when this group goes through neighborhoods at night, and they throw baggies and onto lawns that are weighted down with like rice or beans so that the wind can't blow it away. And then you open up the flyers, and it's pretty awful stuff. And we get calls from community members, and police chiefs call our office to report it to us, and we try to help them to find some resolution. So just my point is the same thing that Leo Frank dealt with back in 1913, we're still dealing with today in so many ways. Which brings me to this question, which I'm going to give it to Carolyn, which says, how is it possible in today's society that both the far left and far right are anti-Semitic? It would seem logical that only one of them would be anti-Semitic, but not both sides. Carolyn or Howard?
Yeah, you could take this too.
Well, you go ahead, and then I'll add something.
So Howard keeps using the word tropes. You've heard me use the word tropes. These are conspiracy theories. Whenever people are fearful, they look for somebody to blame. When you look at any point in history, and Jews have been, since anti-Semitism is called the oldest form of hatred in the world. Because when people are fearful, and Howard mentioned people worrying about people taking their jobs, or people worrying about taking their money, or things like that. People worried about getting sick from COVID. People worried about, immigration. All these things. Fear leads to blame. Who do we blame? Jews are easy to blame because there's about a half a dozen, 7, 8 tropes over the years. And they started with, the collective blame, the deicide, the collective blame of Jews for the killing of Jesus, right? That's only one, and that's the one that's the only one linked to any type of religion. The rest of the tropes, blood libel, Jewish power, Jewish money, duality, the idea that Jews can only be loyal to their Judaism or Israel, anti-Holocaust, all that, all those other tropes are born out of fear and conspiracy. And so why are we dealing with them now? 5,000, 7,000, 10,000, however many years you think people have been walking the earth. If we're Jewish, we think it's more than 5. If we started counting in 57, 87 or whatever. So, it's been around for a long time. Until people are self-actualized enough to say, I'm not going to be fearful, or if I am fearful, I'm going to look for the real reason for me to fear. Not in the plague, not to fear Jews because they weren't getting sick as much. Fear the rats that were carrying disease. Until we start doing that, we're going to continue to have this. Conspiracy theories are very hard to combat because you start to try and use facts with them, and people say, but that's what they want you to think. So how do we deal with that? We rely on facts. We continue to talk about it. We continue to lay out. We talk with people. Why is it on both sides of the spectrum? Why is it on the left and on the right? It doesn't really matter. It's all around us. So as Jews, I tell people, don't worry if it's on the left or the right. It's anti-Semitism. We have to be one Jewish people. We have to fight anti-Semitism wherever it comes from, left or right. Do I have a reason about, somebody asked me a while ago, when are we going to get rid of anti-Semitism? Not in my lifetime, unfortunately. No one at ADL is working themselves out of a job. You probably have something to add to that.
I would just add, everything you said, I'll just add 1, 2, maybe a couple little things. First of all, in terms of left and right at the same time, the nature of a stereotype, it doesn't take much actual reality to affirm it. So there's the notion of the Jew as the quintessential capitalist, because there's Rothschild, and the notion of the Jew as the quintessential revolutionary or Marxist or socialist, because there's Marx and Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg, and there are conspicuous elements, a few conspicuous Jews visible in revolutions, even though most Jews have always been against these revolutions. Secondly, in America more specifically, right now, it also has to do with the notion of the complex nature of Jewish whiteness. Because the fact of the matter is, right now, for those people who consider whiteness to be a virtue, Jews are not white. And for those people who consider whiteness to be a vice, Jews are white. And all of that, on top of all of that, there is the centrality of Israel in the consciousness of American society, and that kind of animates it just animates all of this. And I think the important thing to remember, I'll just reiterate what I think Carolyn said, but just to make sure, is that it's important for Jews to remember that just because the target of anti-Semitism is someone who disagrees with your politics, if you're Jewish, it doesn't mean it doesn't have anything to do with you. I'll give you a specific example. If the demonizing of George Soros, who is a left-winger, if you're not a left-wing Jew, and you don't think this has nothing to do with you, an attack on any Jew is an attack on every Jew. And it really comes down to conspiracy theories, because the nature of conspiracy theories is that even conspiracy theories don't start as Jewish conspiracy theories, they always wind up. And one of the reasons for that is in Christian society, the original conspiracy theory is the conspiracy theory that said that Jews conspired with the devil to kill Christ. And that's the template for pretty much every subsequent conspiracy theory that ultimately became, or inevitably became, a Jewish conspiracy theory. I guess I did have something to add.
That's actually a perfect segue into another question from the audience, Howard, talking about Jewishness and whiteness. It says, do you believe that today's Jews have a false security in their ability to pass as white Americans?
Oh, that's a great question. A false sense of security. That's I don't know if I've ever heard that question before. I think that the false sense of security isn't whether or not Jews, first of all, it's much easier for white-presenting Jews. We're not talking about Jews of color, that's a separate story. For white-presenting Jews to pass is still a quantum level easier for people of color to pass as white and to gain the benefits of being white. And by the way, it isn't only Jewish. Members of the Chaldean community have the same problem, where their whiteness is also sort of ambivalent as well. So I think the false sense of security is that it's relatively new, whiteness being a vice as extensively as it is now. That's something relatively new. So that's only really become a problem for Jews in the last 15 or 20 years. All the problems with, well, I don't want to get into all those things. But so I think the only false sense of security is maybe a lack of awareness that there is a growing segment of American society that does see whiteness as a vice. But once we're aware of that, then we'll be okay. In terms of the larger sense of security, for me, and I'm not going to say, the country's definitely gotten more anti-Semitic, and thank God for ADL, nice little shout out. Thank God for ADL, but there are two red lines we have not crossed yet. One of them is, and these are the signature features of in other places like in Europe where anti-Semitism went to the next level. One of the lines is anti-Jewish laws. Now there's discrimination, definitely, but we haven't seen anti-Jewish laws. The other thing we have not seen is state-sponsored anti-Jewish violence. There's been violence, but I think for the most part, the American Jewish community can still reliably call the police or the FBI if we have a problem. I mean, there's a police car sitting in the parking lot of my synagogue, or on Wayne campus. There's a police officer sitting outside the office of Hillel, the Hillel on campus. And it's unfortunate that it has to be that way, and that wasn't necessary 10 years ago. But as long as we can still rely on law enforcement to protect us, that's the other red line. Now, if either of those two things, anti-Jewish laws or the reliability of law enforcement to protect us, if either of those two things change, then we're getting into different territory. To me, the situation we're in is not comparable to Germany in the 1920s or the 1930s. Right now, it's comparable to the time of Dreyfus. But remember, ultimately, French society rallied in favor of Dreyfus. And at this point, I'm still cautiously optimistic that American society has the ability to do that. But I will admit, I am not as optimistic as I was 3 years ago or since 2016 or whatever the measure is. Yes, I'm concerned, but we haven't crossed the red lines.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and it's for Erica. So the musical parade is Tony Award winning. Which awards did you win? And also, when are the Tonys? And also, are you up again for more awards?
Oh, I wish it worked that way because I think we should win every award
perfect.
all the time. So the Tonys really unfairly just measure Broadway, right? So the show was on Broadway 2 years ago and it won Best Musical Revival. And the director, Michael Arden, won for Best Direction for his direction of this production, the production that you will see that's coming to the Fisher Theater. Did I answer everything? No. Oh, the Tonys are in June. And every year they take the kind of latest slate of Broadway offerings. So it's from June of last year through June of this year. Unfortunately, they don't have a kind of like the best of touring, though that would be awesome because I would love to get more awards. But it's wonderful to be recognized, and it's wonderful because the awards really do propel a show's ability to then go on tour. And so once we won those awards, we quickly moved to contact cities and say, we want to bring Parade on tour. We know this story is incredibly important. And having that award helps. We still are in a capitalist society and selling tickets is important. So those kinds of things do help give an audience a little bit more kind of familiarity and a valid stamp of approval.
And you're in at the Fisher from, I want to say like February 25th to March 9th. Something to that effect. So there's some time to come and see the play.
Laura, I'm going to give a shout out. On the 26th of February, ADL is taking a number of people, and we're having a special program after the show with a producer and some people at the Fisher. So on the back of that card that I referenced, on one side there's a QR code for the ADL reflection guide that talks a little bit about the kinds of production values of this story. On the back is a connection to the Fisher Theater. So I would say go to the Fisher Theater or go to the box office, buy tickets, tell people about the show. Howie, I have seen this show. I saw the show on Broadway. I'm also going to see it here in Detroit. It is a wonderful, wonderful production. And it is very thoughtful, and the music is very, very beautiful. There's some remarkable scenes in it. It's not an easy show. As a person who works for ADL, tears started flowing out of my eyes from the moment Leo Frank walked on the stage. But like most difficult things, it's important to do. So I would say, call the Fisher Theater, get yourself some tickets, and if you come on the 26th, definitely stay after the show and join the ADL group that's going.
Thanks so much.